Let's talk about body planes, directions, and cavities. And this is something we went over the first day in class, but that feels like it was a million years ago, so I feel like this is a good thing to cover again. The idea being that as anatomists or biologists or medical people, we have to have a way to talk about the body in a way that's common for everyone, because what's right to me could be your left, what's north, if someone's standing on their head, is actually south, etc. So we like to make sure when we're describing something as being medial, it's towards the center. If it's lateral, it's away. If it's towards the head, it's superior, etc. We're going to go through all of it. So again, so the reason why we go over these things, we like to talk about what's called anatomical position. So whenever we're talking about someone in an anatomical position, whether or not they're standing in their underwear or not, they are standing, feet flat on the ground, shoulders back, their head pointing forward, and their arms are, instead of just resting naturally, the thumbs are pointing out or laterally. Okay, so that is your first term, lateral. Let's move on. So if someone is in anatomical position, you can use these terms. Even so, if this person was then lying a different way, the thumb is still considered lateral, even if it's like across his face, because that's just, if we moved him back to anatomical position, that would be correct. So we base everything on this form, even though we don't always see people in this form. Okay, so again, you're going to be anatomical position. You have to be facing forward, standing erect, arms at your sides with the palms facing outward. So when we do this, we can then split the body depending on if you're cutting, depending on where you're cutting the body, and the reasoning is that we can then create directional terms based on these planes. Okay, so if you cut someone into left and right sections, you're cutting a medial plane. If you're cutting above and below, and it's not just here, so I could cut a transverse plane through the top of the head. So you can cut a transverse plane here, and then when you're talking about that, you're talking about inferior and superior, okay? So anything that is inferior and superior is talking about on a transverse plane, okay? So in this case, the fingers are inferior to the thumb when you're in anatomical position. You would not say that one finger is inferior to another finger, though, because that's the wrong plane. You're not cutting through the body in that case. You're cutting in a different way, so you don't do that. We also have, so that the medial cuts left and right, the transverse cuts inferior, superior, and then this plane back here, the coronal plate, is cutting front and back. And so when we do that, we can then get, so I said front and back, that's not the technical terminology. We're talking about posterior and anterior. So again, you could say that your ankle is posterior to your toes, but you wouldn't say that your ankle is inferior to your toes, because that is in the wrong plane. If you're standing up, feet flat on the ground, they're both equally flat. So there's no way to say one is above the other or not, as you would if you're looking at something on the transverse plane. They're both in the same plane transversely, so you can't say it's inferior or superior. You can only say that it is instead posterior or anterior. We're going to go over this a little bit more. So the transverse plane is that horizontal plane that gives us the top and bottom halves. Whenever that happens, superior is something above something, inferior is something below. So this was a lab question. The knee is superior to the ankle but inferior to the hip. Some people put distal instead, and the distal and proximal are terms that you really only use in reference to something else. It's better to say, if you're just saying the knee is superior to the ankle, that means it's above the ankle. It's inferior to the hip, that means it is below the hip. If you were putting these in a line, you would say that the knee is more distal. That's a bad example. You would say that the ankle is more distal to the hip than the knee is, but you can't just use two of them and then go with it. So it's better if you're just looking at two things, you're talking about inferior and superior, if you're talking about something that's above or below the next thing. Okay, so the transverse plane again is cutting here. And remember, this plane basically can move up and down the body. So anytime you have something above something else, that's considered superior. Anytime it's below, that's inferior. Sometimes you hear that as cranial versus, sometimes you hear cranial. It's a weird thing. That just means towards the head. We are very head-centric as humans. The head is very important. That yeah, it gets a little weird. If you're going into vet school, you might hear caudal versus cranial. If you think about an animal on four legs, if it's going towards the head, that is in fact, if you're moving towards the head this way, that is going superior. You could also consider it cranial. When you're moving caudal, you're moving down towards the tail. We don't have a tail, so we don't usually hear that in terms in human anatomy. Instead, you hear inferior. So something is superior by being above, it's inferior by being below. You could say that your chin in anatomical position is inferior to your ears. Because it is, even though the ears are further back on a different plane, the chin is still below the ears. Okay, so that's transverse plane. So here's that cranial caudal thing again. So if you want to write these things down, it's a good place to pause. Cranial means it's located near the head or superior. Caudal means near the sacral region of the spinal cord or the tail. Okay. Again, here is another example. When we look at the sacral region of the spinal cord, it's the butt, basically. Okay, so it's the last part of your spinal cord. If you remember from your axial skeleton, it's the last part of the spine, and it's where these all fuse in adults, so they become one continuous bone in the sacrum. The very last one is the coccyx. That's our tailbone, our literal tailbone. Sometimes people can have an extension of this if they're born with tails. It's very rare thing, but it does happen. And in other animals, we do see this being extended into a tail, and that would be more caudal than anything in the head. But that is, if something is caudal, it's moving towards the sacrum. If it's cranial, it's moving towards the head. Or again, caudal is the same as inferior. Cranial is the same as superior. All right. So what about that mid-sagittal plane or medial plane? That's this one that cuts left and right. So what's happening here, it divides us left and right. Anything that's close to the midline is considered medial, okay, midline medial, or okay. Anything that moves away from that midline is lateral, okay. So a midline, so if you're moving out away from that plane and towards the hand, you're more lateral. So if you're making a lateral incision, you're moving this way, okay? If you are, I don't know why I thought of that, but I think I've heard that in an ER episode or something, or Grey's Anatomy or something. If you are moving, so lateral means side also if you're taking different languages, romantic-based languages. If something is lateral, to the side, a medial is towards the center. When you're looking at bones, there is, in a couple of the long bones, you have medial and lateral epicondyles. That tells you the medial one is going to be the one pointed towards the center. The lateral one is going to be the one pointed away from the body. So the medial one, like the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, I believe, is the one that is on the same side as the head of the humerus, which means because the head of the humerus has to fit into the shoulder blade, the glenoid cavity, okay, which is going to be medial, okay, it's going to be pointing towards the center. So the medial epicondyle is going to be the one that's on the same side as the head, so it's pointing in towards the body. The lateral epicondyle is going to be pointing out away from the body because it's towards the outside, not towards the middle. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Let's see, we talk about the frontal plane or the coronal plane. That is where, that's this one, it moves us into the front and the back, okay? So if you can think the frontal or coronal, so coronal, it's called this because it's basically where someone would wear a crown. It's also based, the coronal suture is also the idea being where you would wear a crown. It's going to be the one that divides your skull into the front and the back. There's history there, I don't understand. But it's dividing into the front and the back. And so when we're talking about front and back, we're talking about the ventral or the anterior. So ventral is basically, I always think of, there's some word, if something is visceral, it's like your gut feeling, and for some reason I think visceral and ventral, that's going towards the guts. And then dorsal or posterior, you can remember, so dolphins have a dorsal fin, it's on their back. Your posterior is you're talking about in layman's terms, that is your butt, and so that is in your back. It's going towards your back. So anything that is posterior to something else is going to be moving towards the back of your body when you're in anatomical position. So if you're thinking about if we talk about like external anatomy, if someone has mammary tissue or breast tissue, that is going to be ventral to the heart, because the idea is it's more towards the front of the body and the heart is inside the body. We can only hope, and so that's going to be more posterior in comparison, but then the heart is going to be ventral to the spine because the spine is behind the heart, okay? So again, these things are relative to other things very often. So again, if we look at this, if we're looking at external anatomy, the elbow, when you're in anatomical position, the inside of your elbow is on the ventral side. The outside of the part where you hit your elbow, if you're hitting your elbow on your funny bone, is on the posterior side or the dorsal side. So again, anterior is the same as ventral. Posterior is the same as dorsal. Okay, other things. So when we're going down the long bones and we're comparing things in reference, we can talk about something being more proximal or more distal. So your most distal phalanx is going to be your let's look at this as an example. So your distal phalanx, so your phalanges are your finger bones and your toe bones. So your distal phalanx is the one at the very end because there's nowhere else to go. That's really the only part where you can just kind of call it that by itself. If you're talking about the proximal part of the forearm, is the closer part of the forearm, but that's in comparison to something else. So see how we have two different parts that are proximal part of the arms. So this is the proximal part of the arm because it's closer to the rest of the body, and the distal part of this part of the arm is further from the body, okay? But if I were to ask you, is the elbow more proximal to the radius, which is going to be here, or to the phalanges, which are your finger bones, you would say, oh, the elbow is more proximal to the radius than it is to the fingers because that is further away, okay? So proximal means it's something closer, and distal means it's something further away, but usually you're talking only in reference to something else. You can't just say, the knee is distal. That tells me nothing. Are you talking about, is it distal to itself? That doesn't make any sense. Is it distal compared to the heart? Is it distal compared to the hip? Okay, the knee is distal, more distal to the heart than the hip is because it's further away. But it's not more distal to the hip than the thigh is, right? That doesn't make sense. And so usually when we talk about distal and proximal, we're talking about things that are closer and farther away to something else. Okay, so the wrist is distal to it's we left something out. So if the elbow is proximal to the shoulder, oh my goodness, this sentence makes no sense. Let's just take that out. The ankle is distal and the knee is proximal to the hip. Okay, so we have to, oh, I see what that last one is, whatever. So we have to have that third thing in reference for this to make sense. So if we go back to this one, if the shoulder is the point of reference, the wrist is more distal than the elbow, okay? But if we're talking about our fingers, so if instead of shoulder, this said fingers, the wrist would be more proximal and the elbow would be more distal because it's in comparison to the fingers, okay? So this is all about comparing to a third thing. So we also talked a lot about, well, we haven't actually talked a lot about body cavities, but once we get into the organ systems, these are going to be important. There's two main body cavities. We have a dorsal or posterior cavity, and then we have a ventral or anterior cavity. So dorsal and posterior, remember the same thing. That's your back side. So this is a cavity in the back, and the ventral or anterior cavity is basically the front. So your dorsal cavity contains it's everything on this side. So the cranial cavity is off by itself. It's kind of dorsal. This is an interesting misspelling. The cranial cavity is superior to the thoracic cavity. So look what I did there. Okay, it's above it. The ventral cavity is going to be the side that's towards the front. Okay, whereas the dorsal cavity, there's not much in that cavity other than the spine. There are a bunch of muscles and bones here, but there's not really much cavity to it. We can also break down this body cavity further by saying we have a thoracic cavity. So anytime you see thoracic, you're talking about the lungs or the thorax or the lungs and heart. If you're talking about the abdominal cavity, it's separated by from the thorax by the diaphragm, which is a muscle here that helps you breathe. We'll talk a lot about that. And then we can also, there's nothing here that like technically divides us other than some tissues that kind of keep things separate. But there's no muscle here. But we can divide the digestive system away from the pelvic cavity, so the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, based on sort of on function, by saying, so this is all mostly digestive system, this is urinary and reproductive system. We can kind of think about those things like this is the pelvic cavity because it's sitting inside the pelvis or the hip bones, the os coxa, there we go, where this is not sitting in the pelvis at all, so we can kind of keep it a little bit separate, but there's no actual line here like there is here with the diaphragm actually separating it. All right. Okay, so this kind of just goes into it more. The cranial cavity contains the brain. The spinal contains the spine. The ventral, we talked about this. If you want to pause, though, and write these things down, that's a good place. And the thoracic contains, so it's more than just sorry, to go a little further, we like to overgeneralize by saying the thoracic cavity is just the heart and the lungs, but there's a lot of other stuff going on in there. There's a lot of tubes. So we have a food tube, or the esophagus. We have some breathing tubes, the trachea and the bronchi, which are connecting the lungs to the outside world. And we have a lot of large blood vessels, which we're going to learn all about later. Okay, so this is if you want to learn specifically what is in every part, but this isn't super specific to what I'm talking about today. I just want to kind of keep in mind that the abdominal cavity can be broken up into the, it could just be abdominal if you're talking about all the guts at once and in the below your diaphragm. It could also be broken into the pelvic and the abdominal cavity if you're just looking at what's related to what bones are around there. Okay, so if this is the upper part of the cavity, this is the small intestines is kind of covering where the urinary bladder and some reproductive functions are. Okay, but it's kind of spilling out a little bit in my opinion. So then the pelvic cavity is a bit lower than people expect. In females, that'll contain the uterus and ovaries. In the males, I guess you can kind of consider that it contains part of the reproductive system. Most of it is external, which we'll talk about. The kidneys, on the other hand, are the only organs that actually don't sit in these cavities. The kidneys actually sit outside of these cavities. So if you've ever heard of someone getting a kidney punch, they're getting punched in the back, and so the kidneys are kind of sitting back here where they can really be, it's just for some reason they're separate. Whatever. It doesn't not work, so evolution went with it. Okay, so this is where I'm talking about. The retroperitoneal space is where the kidneys are. The adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys, and they're separated by a kind of tissue called the peritoneum. The peritoneum was in the news recently as, and the peritoneum and the mesentery, which are two tissue layers, as being a new organ that we've never discovered before, which is silly because it's not that it has never been discovered, it's just that a new function has been found for it, maybe, if it's even what we think it is. Whatever, moving on. This is a section where you're looking, if you had cut straight through on this plane, the medial plane that's dividing someone into left and right, so if you're like, I don't even understand, well, this is the butt, okay? So here is where the colon is going, so it kind of it moves around a lot. The kidneys would sit outside of this, okay? I don't really like this picture. Let's move on. Okay, so we have a couple other cavities which are going to become important when if you're trying to orient yourself in the skull. Okay, the nasal cavity has your nose structures. There are a lot of sinuses here. The orbital cavity is where your eyes are. Hopefully you're learning the parts of the bones that you need to know about this. The buccal cavity, we normally just call it the mouth. That's going to be where your teeth and your tongue are. We'll talk about those later. And yeah, that's if you want to practice and look at these, something like this, pause it now, test yourself on what sections are called. You could, in the lab we talked about dividing the abdominal section into quadrants. It's kind of hard because guts can shift around a little bit on where they are, but doctors like to talk about, I've made an incision in the upper right quadrant to access whatever's behind it. I'm not going to be testing you on this part, so don't worry too much about that, but this is kind of how it separates out. Okay, so the liver is mostly in the upper right quadrant, because again, we're thinking in anatomical terminology, so this is this person's upper left or upper right. Okay, the colon is almost entirely in the two lower quadrants, but you do see it's not like the body's like, oh, I better stay in my quadrants. It's just kind of a general system. That is, we're going to get to muscle movement, so I'm going to stop here. So hopefully this helps clarify some of those directional terms, and I will see you guys for the next module, which I will post in 2 days. Bye.